In the centuries after his death, a legend took shape that bore only a passing resemblance to the man who inspired it. Storytellers in Rome, medieval monks in Europe, poets in Persia, all of them borrowed his name and refashioned him into whatever their age needed most. He became a philosopher in armor, a visionary who marched east not merely to conquer but to uplift, carrying Greek learning like a torch into lands they imagined as dark and unlettered. It is one of the most flattering portraits ever painted of a military commander, and almost none of it survives contact with the historical record. The real story begins not with a dreamer, but with a kingdom most Greeks considered barely civilized. Macedonia sat on the northern fringe of the Greek-speaking world, a rough landscape of mountains, timber, and horse pasture, ruled by kings who spent as much energy fending off assassination by their own relatives as they did fighting foreign enemies. The southern city-states, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, looked down on Macedonians as something between cousins and barbarians, people who spoke a coarse dialect and drank their wine undiluted, which in Greek eyes was practically a confession of savagery. It was the young king's father who dragged this backwater into the center of Greek politics, and he did it through a military revolution. Philip II inherited a kingdom under siege from nearly every direction and, within a single generation, turned it into the dominant power on the Greek peninsula. His genius was organizational. He took the traditional Greek infantry formation, the phalanx, a tight block of soldiers pushing forward with shields and spears, and reinvented it. His troops carried pikes nearly 6 meters long, called sarissas, which meant the first several rows could project their weapons beyond the front line simultaneously. The effect was something like a giant hedgehog advancing across a battlefield, almost impossible to approach from the front. But Philip understood that infantry alone won battles only slowly. He paired his phalanx with heavy cavalry trained to strike at the flanks and rear of an enemy formation once the long spears had pinned it in place. He added specialized units, light skirmishers, siege engineers, allied horsemen from the Thessalian plains, and drilled them to work together in ways no Greek army had attempted before. The result was not just a strong army, but a system, flexible enough to adapt to different terrain and different enemies, and professional enough to campaign year after year without dissolving. This was the inheritance that passed to his son. When the young prince rose to the Macedonian throne, barely out of adolescence and already tested in battle, he received the finest military instrument the ancient Mediterranean had yet produced. His name was Alexander, and he did not have to build this machine. He had only to aim it. What he did not inherit was anything resembling a plan for what came after victory. Philip had spent his reign unifying Macedonia, subduing the Greek city-states, and preparing an invasion of the Persian Empire. But his ambitions appear to have been focused on conquest in the military sense, seizing territory, extracting tribute, punishing an old enemy. The question of how to actually govern a vast, multilingual empire stretching across different cultures and climates was one Philip never had to answer, because an assassin's blade ended his life before the Persian campaign began. Alexander stepped into a role that was perfectly designed for winning wars, and almost entirely silent on the subject of keeping the peace. He had been tutored by Aristotle, a fact that later admirers seized on as proof of his philosophical depth, but the lessons of a Greek teacher offered little practical guidance for administering Egyptian provinces or managing Persian court rituals. His education gave him a love of Homer and a taste for heroic glory, not a framework for statecraft. This gap between an extraordinary capacity for destruction and a near-total absence of any theory of governance is the tension that would define everything that followed. Alexander possessed the sharpest sword in the known world and the training to wield it with devastating precision. But he had no clear idea of what to build once the sword had done its work. It was into this void, this space between the battlefield and the throne room, that the problems of his reign would eventually rush with a force that no cavalry charge could answer. Whatever else might be said about Alexander, his ability to read a battlefield was something close to preternatural. He did not simply command armies, he seemed to understand the living geometry of combat in real time, sensing where a line was about to buckle, where a gap was forming in the enemy's formation, and how to exploit it before the opportunity closed. This was not a skill he learned from textbooks or inherited passively from his father. It was something he demonstrated again and again under conditions that would have paralyzed more cautious generals. The first great test came along the coast of what is now southern Turkey, where a narrow coastal plain was pinched between mountains and the sea. The Persian king had assembled a massive force and chosen ground that should have favored his numerical advantage, but the terrain was more complex than simple numbers could decide. A shallow river cut across the battlefield, and the Persian line was stretched along its far bank, anchored by Greek mercenary infantry at the center and cavalry on the flanks. Most commanders would have seen a defensive position too strong to assault head-on. Alexander saw something else entirely. Rather than matching strength against strength across the whole line, he loaded his best cavalry onto the right flank and led the charge himself, driving obliquely across the river and into the Persian left before it could properly react. The effect was not just physical, but psychological. The sight of the Macedonian king plunging directly toward the Persian command shattered the cohesion of the units nearest the impact. Once that flank collapsed, the center became exposed, and what had been an orderly defensive position turned into a rout. The Persian king fled the field, and an army that had outnumbered Alexander's force broke apart in a matter of hours. This pattern would repeat itself on an even grander scale a few years later on the plains of Mesopotamia. There, the Persian king had prepared far more carefully, choosing a wide, flat expanse where his chariots and vastly superior numbers could be brought to bear without the constraints of narrow terrain. He even had the ground leveled to give his scythed chariots a clear run at the Macedonian line. By every conventional measure, the conditions favored the larger army. Yet, Alexander refused to play the conventional game. He angled his advance to the right, pulling the Persian line out of its prepared positions and stretching it until a seam opened near the center left of the formation. When that gap appeared, he drove his companion cavalry through it like a wedge, heading straight for the Persian king's position. Once again, the personal charge carried an almost theatrical force. The sight of Alexander bearing down on the royal guard created a crisis of nerve at the very heart of the enemy army. The Persian king turned and fled for the second time, and the largest force the empire could muster disintegrated behind him. These victories were genuinely extraordinary, and they deserve the admiration military historians have given them for centuries. The ability to identify a decisive point under the smoke and confusion of ancient battle, to commit reserves at precisely the right moment, and to lead from the front without losing control of the larger engagement, all of this marked Alexander as a tactical mind of the highest order. He combined the instincts of a cavalry officer with the vision of a commanding general, and his soldiers followed him with a ferocity that multiplied his advantages. But tactical brilliance and strategic wisdom are not the same thing, and the distinction matters enormously. A tactician wins battles. A strategist wins the peace that follows. Alexander's campaigns rolled forward with breathtaking speed, from the Aegean coast deep into Egypt, then east across Mesopotamia, through the Iranian plateau, and eventually toward the frontiers of India. Yet behind the advancing army, there was remarkably little infrastructure of governance being left in place. Cities were founded, or at least named, and loyal officers were installed as governors, but there was no coherent administrative system connecting these scattered outposts to one another or to any central authority. The conquered territories were simply too vast and too diverse for this approach to hold together under anything other than constant pressure from the top. Persian provinces that had functioned for generations under an elaborate imperial bureaucracy, with standardized roads, a postal relay system, and local satraps answering to a clear chain of command, were now nominally under Macedonian control but practically ungoverned. Alexander often left former Persian officials in place, not out of any developed philosophy of inclusive rule, but because there was simply no one else available who understood how to collect taxes or adjudicate local disputes. This created a paradox that would define the campaign's deeper fragility. The empire could only maintain cohesion as long as Alexander kept moving forward, because forward momentum was the only force binding it together. Each new conquest provided fresh plunder to pay the troops and fresh glory to justify the hardship, but it also added another poorly administered territory to a chain already stretched to breaking. There was no mechanism for consolidation, no pause in which institutions could take root, no plan for what the empire would look like once the marching stopped. Alexander had perfected the art of winning without ever confronting the problem of holding. His father's military system had given him the tools to defeat any army he faced, and his own genius allowed him to wield those tools with devastating precision. But the very speed and decisiveness that made his conquests possible also made them hollow. Brilliant victories strung across a continent, like beads on a thread that no one had bothered to tie at either end. The conquests that carried Alexander's army across the ancient world were not bloodless exercises in tactical elegance. Behind every sweeping cavalry charge and every shattered enemy line lay a reality that admirers have often preferred to gloss over: the systematic and sometimes extraordinary violence inflicted on populations that refused to submit. The battles against rival armies, spectacular as they were, accounted for only part of the destruction. Much of the killing happened after the pitched fighting was over, in sieges, reprisals, and campaigns of deliberate terror designed to make an example of anyone who dared resist. The Siege of Tyre offers perhaps the starkest illustration. A Phoenician trading hub built partly on the mainland and partly on an island fortress about half a mile offshore, Tyre was one of the great commercial centers of the eastern Mediterranean. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the city's leaders offered a kind of cautious neutrality. They would not fight him, but neither would they open their gates. For most conquerors, this would have been an acceptable compromise from a city that posed no serious military threat. Alexander treated it as defiance. What followed was a siege lasting roughly 7 months, marked by extraordinary determination and brutality. Unable to reach the island city by sea alone, Alexander ordered his engineers to build a massive causeway stretching from the shore out to the island walls, an engineering feat that still impresses historians, accomplished through forced labor and relentless pressure on his own troops. The Tyrians fought with desperate ingenuity, launching fire ships against the causeway, conducting naval sorties, and pouring boiling sand onto soldiers who reached the walls. When the city finally fell, Alexander's response was not the magnanimity that legend often attributes to him. Ancient sources report that roughly 8,000 defenders were killed during the final assault, and approximately 2,000 military-age men were crucified along the shoreline, a punishment designed not merely to kill but to humiliate and terrorize. The remaining population, perhaps 30,000 people, was sold into slavery. The message was unmistakable. Neutrality was not an option, and resistance would be met with annihilation. This was not an isolated incident driven by the frustrations of a difficult siege. The pattern repeated itself wherever populations proved stubborn. In the region the Greeks called Bactria, a vast, mountainous territory stretching across parts of what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, Alexander encountered a kind of resistance his army had not faced before. There were no great set-piece battles to be won, no single king whose flight would cause an empire to collapse. Instead, local populations fought in loose, shifting networks, using their knowledge of the terrain to ambush supply lines, melt into mountain passes, and regroup after every apparent defeat. This style of warfare enraged Alexander in ways that conventional battles never did. A pitched engagement, however bloody, followed rules he understood and excelled at. Bactria offered no such clarity, and the harder he pushed, the more the resistance seemed to spread. His response was not patience or negotiation, but a campaign of systematic devastation, aimed at making continued resistance physically impossible. Entire valleys were depopulated. Fortified towns that harbored rebels were stormed and their inhabitants killed or enslaved, and agricultural land was destroyed to deny sustenance to fighters hiding in the hills. Ancient sources describe Alexander dividing his forces into mobile columns that swept through the countryside, burning settlements and driving survivors into areas where they could be cornered. The pacification of Bactria consumed more time and more lives than any of his famous victories over Persian armies. What makes this violence historically significant is not simply its scale. Other ancient conquerors were equally or more destructive, but the tension it creates with the image of Alexander as a civilizing force. The notion that he carried Greek culture eastward as a gift becomes difficult to sustain when the vehicle for that culture was the systematic enslavement of coastal cities and the burning of Central Asian farmland. The populations on the receiving end of these campaigns did not experience themselves as being enlightened. They experienced themselves as being conquered, and the distinction mattered. There is a tendency in historical narrative to treat military violence as background noise, regrettable but inevitable, a cost of doing business in the ancient world. And it is true that Alexander operated within norms most of his contemporaries would have recognized, since siege warfare was brutal everywhere and the enslavement of defeated populations was standard practice. But acknowledging that context should not become an excuse for ignoring the specific choices Alexander made. At Tyre, he could have accepted neutrality and moved on. In Bactria, he could have relied on diplomacy with local elites, as the Persians before him had often done. Instead, he chose exemplary violence, and he chose it repeatedly. The reason matters as much as the act. These punitive campaigns were not expressions of mindless cruelty, but calculated instruments of policy, or rather, substitutes for policy. Lacking the administrative machinery to hold conquered territory through governance, Alexander relied on fear to do the work that institutions could not. The crucifixions at Tyre, the scorched valleys of Bactria, the mass enslavements that followed dozens of smaller engagements, all warned the next city, the next province, the next mountain tribe that the cost of resistance would be absolute. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the campaigns. The very speed and decisiveness that made Alexander's conquests possible also made them dependent on a kind of violence that no empire can sustain indefinitely. Fear is an effective tool in the short term, but it breeds resentment that festers beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when its source is removed. Every crucified defender and every enslaved family became a reason for future rebellion, a debt of hatred that would come due the instant Alexander's personal grip on the empire weakened. He was building not on foundations, but on fault lines, and the tremors were already beginning. The conquests had carried Alexander from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of the old Persian world, and with every passing year, the nature of his problem shifted. Defeating the Persian king on the battlefield had been, in a sense, the simple part. It required courage, speed, and the superb military instrument his father had built. But once the palaces and treasuries of the empire lay in his hands, he faced a question that no amount of cavalry charges could resolve. How does a Macedonian king actually govern millions of people who are not Macedonian, who do not speak Greek, and whose civilization is in many respects older and more sophisticated than his own? The Persian Empire that Alexander had overthrown was not a primitive thing waiting to be replaced by something better. It had functioned for over 2 centuries as one of the most effective administrative systems the ancient world had ever produced. Provincial governors, called satraps, managed enormous territories with a degree of local autonomy, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and dispensing justice according to traditions that varied widely from region to region. A royal postal network linked the provinces to the capital, and a complex court hierarchy kept the whole structure oriented toward the king at its center. Simply smashing this system and replacing it with Greek institutions was not a realistic option because no such institutions existed at the necessary scale. Alexander appears to have recognized this, at least in practical terms. Almost from the beginning, he retained Persian officials in their existing posts wherever possible, allowing satraps to continue governing provinces they already understood. This was not generosity, it was necessity. His Macedonian officers were superb soldiers, but they had no training in managing irrigation systems along the Tigris, no knowledge of the tax structures that sustained the old empire's eastern provinces, and no credibility with local populations who had never seen a Greek before. Using Persian administrators was the only way to keep the machinery of government turning while the army moved on. But what began as pragmatic improvisation gradually became something more deliberate and far more controversial. As Alexander spent more time in the former Persian capitals, surrounded by the wealth and ceremony of a court that dwarfed anything Macedonia could have imagined, he began adopting elements of Persian royal culture for himself. He started wearing a blended costume that combined Macedonian and Eastern dress, appointed Persians not just as provincial administrators, but as members of his inner circle, and began to speak of the conquered peoples not as subjects to be exploited, but as partners in a shared empire. To a modern observer, this might sound like enlightened policy, but to the Macedonian veterans who had bled their way across half a continent, it felt like betrayal. These were men who had fought under the explicit understanding that they were Greeks making war on barbarians, warriors of a superior civilization subjugating an inferior one. The entire ideological framework of the campaign, inherited from Philip and reinforced by every Greek intellectual who had ever written about Persia, rested on a sharp distinction between Greek and non-Greek, between the free citizen and the servile subject of a despotic king. Now their own commander seemed to be erasing that distinction, elevating the very people they had defeated to positions of equality or even honor. The friction built slowly, expressed first in grumbling and quiet resentment, then in open confrontation. The sharpest flashpoint came over a single court ritual that crystallized everything the Macedonians feared. It was called proskynesis, and understanding why it provoked such fury requires grasping what the gesture meant in two entirely different cultural contexts. In Persian tradition, proskynesis was a ritual of respect performed before the king, a bow, or in some cases, a more elaborate prostration depending on the performer's rank. It was a gesture of social hierarchy, not of worship. Persians performed it routinely, without any implication that the king was a god, much as a modern person might stand when a judge enters a courtroom without believing the judge to be divine. For Greeks and Macedonians, however, the gesture carried a completely different meaning. In their world, prostrating oneself before another human being was something done only before the gods. A free Greek bowed to no mortal. This was, in their minds, one of the defining differences between Greek liberty and Persian civility. To ask a Macedonian officer to perform proskynesis was, in his understanding, to ask him to acknowledge Alexander not as a king among men, but as a living deity demanding worship from those who had once been his equals. Alexander apparently attempted to introduce the practice at a court gathering, testing whether his inner circle would accept it. The Persian courtiers, for whom the gesture was entirely natural, complied without hesitation. But among the Macedonians, the reaction was immediate and visceral. One of the most senior officers openly refused, and according to ancient accounts, mocked the ritual publicly, calling it an oriental degradation unworthy of free men. The moment became a public rupture, revealing a fault line that no amount of royal authority could simply command away. What made the proskynesis controversy so dangerous was that it touched something deeper than etiquette. It was a proxy for the fundamental question of what kind of empire Alexander was trying to build, and who would have a place in it. If Persian nobles could stand beside Macedonian generals as equals, if the conquered could rise to the same status as the conquerors, then what exactly had the army been fighting for? The veterans had endured years of forced marches, brutal sieges, and staggering casualties on the understanding that victory would bring them glory and supremacy. The emerging reality, a hybrid court where the old hierarchies were dissolving, threatened to strip their sacrifices of meaning. Alexander himself seems to have been caught between competing pressures he could neither fully reconcile nor safely ignore. He needed the Persian administrative class to run his empire, and he appeared genuinely drawn to the grandeur of the culture he had conquered. But he also depended utterly on the loyalty of his Macedonian soldiers, men whose willingness to follow him into battle was the only thing that held his conquests together. Every step toward the east alienated the west, and every concession to Macedonian pride risked making the empire ungovernable. He was attempting to fuse two civilizations that each regarded the other with suspicion, doing so through sheer force of personality, without any institutional framework to support the effort. The proskynesis experiment was quietly abandoned. Alexander apparently judged that pushing it further would cost him more loyalty than it gained in administrative coherence. But beneath the surface, the situation looked bleak. It simply went underground, seeping into the relationships between the king and his oldest companions, poisoning bonds that had once been forged in shared danger and unquestioned trust. The men who had followed a young Macedonian prince across the known world were now serving something they barely recognized, a ruler who dressed like a Persian, surrounded himself with former enemies, and seemed to value their devotion less with every passing season. The empire that Alexander had built by the force of his personality was beginning to exert a pressure that no single mind could withstand. What had started as a campaign against a rival kingdom had become something far more unwieldy, a patchwork of conquered provinces stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush, held together by little more than the king's presence and the army's willingness to follow him. Administering such a territory would have taxed a mature bureaucratic state with generations of institutional memory behind it. Alexander was attempting it on horseback, making decisions at the speed of a forced march, with no permanent capital, no reliable chain of command, and an inner circle whose loyalty was fraying under the weight of exhaustion and cultural alienation. The pattern of Alexander's behavior in the years following his conquest of the Persian heartland suggests a man increasingly unable to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. This is not unusual among rulers who hold absolute power over vast domains. The very scope of their authority makes betrayal both more likely and more difficult to detect, creating a feedback loop in which suspicion breeds isolation and isolation breeds deeper suspicion. For Alexander, the problem was compounded by the fact that he had real enemies, both among the conquered populations and within his own officer corps, which made it impossible to dismiss every fear as paranoia. The first clear sign that this spiral had reached a dangerous intensity came with the exposure of an alleged conspiracy among some of his junior officers. The details are murky and contested, even in the ancient sources, but the basic outline involves a group of younger men, members of the royal bodyguard, who were accused of plotting to assassinate the king. Whether the conspiracy was genuine, exaggerated, or partly fabricated remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is not in dispute is the ferocity of Alexander's response and the direction in which it expanded. The accused plotters were tried, condemned, and executed. But Alexander did not stop there. The investigation widened to ensnare one of the most distinguished generals in the entire army, a veteran commander who had served not only Alexander but his father before him, and who had been instrumental in some of the campaign's greatest victories. This man had no demonstrated connection to the young conspirators. His alleged crime was that he had known of the plot and failed to report it, a charge that rested on the testimony of his own son, who was among the accused and who may have spoken under duress or in desperation. The general was arrested, tried before an assembly of soldiers, and executed. What happened next revealed the depth of Alexander's fear and the ruthlessness it could produce. Far to the west, in what is now Iran, an elderly commander named Parmenion was serving as governor of a critical province and guardian of the empire's central treasury. Parmenion was not merely a general, He was the most senior military figure in the Macedonian army, a man who had helped plan the invasion itself and who had led the left wing in battle after battle while Alexander charged on the right. He was also the father of the condemned general. Alexander, apparently convinced that Parmenion would rebel upon learning of his son's execution, dispatched riders carrying a secret order. They arrived before any news of the trial could reach the old commander and killed him on the spot. The assassination sent a tremor through the army that never fully subsided. Here was a man who had served the Macedonian crown faithfully for decades, who had no proven involvement in any conspiracy, and who was murdered not for what he had done, but for what he might do. The logic was preventive, eliminate the threat before it materializes, but the effect was corrosive. If Parmenion, the most loyal and most senior of all Alexander's commanders, could be killed on suspicion alone, then no one was safe. Every officer in the army understood this implicitly, and that understanding changed the nature of their relationship with the king. What had once been loyalty rooted in shared purpose began to shade into obedience rooted in fear. Alexander seems to have sensed this shift without fully grasping its cause. He responded not by rebuilding trust, but by restructuring command in ways that prevented any single officer from accumulating enough influence to become a threat. Positions of authority were divided, responsibilities were split, and the informal council of senior companions that had once advised the king was gradually replaced by a more isolated style of decision-making. The army still functioned. It was too well trained to collapse overnight, but something essential in its character had begun to change. The Macedonian officer corps had always prided itself on a tradition of frankness with its kings, a willingness to speak bluntly that set it apart from the servile courts of Eastern monarchs. That tradition was now dying, and Alexander himself was killing it. The final and most devastating rupture came not in a council chamber or a courtroom, but at a drinking party, the kind of gathering that Macedonian warriors had always used to cement bonds and settle grievances with rough honesty. The wine had been flowing heavily when a quarrel broke out between Alexander and one of his oldest companions, a cavalry commander named Clytus, who had saved Alexander's life in the very first major battle of the campaign by cutting down a Persian horseman whose sword was descending on the king's unprotected head. Clytus was no marginal figure. His loyalty had been proven in the most literal way possible, and his right to speak freely was, by Macedonian custom, beyond question. The argument escalated with a speed that suggests both men had been carrying wounds they could no longer contain. Clytus, emboldened by wine and bitterness, began throwing accusations that struck at everything Alexander had become: the Persian dress, the Eastern court rituals, the elevation of conquered peoples over the men who had done the conquering. He invoked the memory of Philip, suggesting that the son's achievements owed more to the army his father had built than to any personal genius. These were not diplomatic criticisms. They were the raw, unfiltered grievances of a veteran who felt that the world he had fought to create was being handed to strangers. Alexander's reaction was not that of a king managing a political challenge. It was the explosion of a man whose identity had been attacked at its most vulnerable point. Accounts vary on the precise sequence. Some sources say guards intervened and Clytus was briefly led away, only to return and resume his tirade, but the outcome is consistent across all the ancient versions. Alexander seized a weapon and killed Clytus with his own hands. The room fell silent. the man who had saved the king's life, lay dead at the king's feet, murdered not by an enemy, but by the friend he had bled to protect. What followed was a display of grief so extreme that some historians have questioned whether it was genuine or performative. Alexander reportedly collapsed beside the body, refused to eat or drink for days, and had to be coaxed back to his duties by his remaining companions. He blamed the wine, the gods, fate, but nothing that led to a change in behavior. The drinking continued, the isolation deepened, and the court grew more guarded and more careful about what truths could safely be spoken in the king's presence. The killing of Clytus mattered not because it was the most consequential of Alexander's acts of violence. The execution of Parmenion had far greater strategic implications, but because it destroyed something that could not be rebuilt. Macedonian kingship had always rested on a kind of compact, an understanding that the king was first among equals, bound to his companions by shared danger and mutual obligation. The murder of Clytus at a feast by the king's own hand, in a fit of drunken rage, shattered that compact beyond repair. It proved that no bond of loyalty, no debt of gratitude, no history of shared sacrifice was strong enough to protect a man who said the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The brotherhood that had carried the army from Macedonia to the edges of the known world had become a fiction, and everyone present that night knew it. By the time the army crossed the mountain passes into the plains of the Indus Valley, the campaign had already lasted the better part of a decade. The men who had set out from Macedonia as young soldiers were now weathered veterans carrying wounds both visible and invisible, and many had buried companions in every province between the Aegean and the Hindu Kush. They had followed Alexander through battles that became legends, through deserts and mountain ranges that tested the limits of physical endurance, and through a series of internal crises that had stripped away the old bonds of trust that once held the army together. What awaited them beyond the Indus was supposed to be the final chapter, the edge of the world itself, or so Alexander seemed to believe. The lands east of the Indus were not empty or disorganized. They were home to powerful kingdoms with large armies, fertile river systems that supported dense populations, and military traditions entirely unlike anything the Macedonians had encountered before. The most formidable of these kingdoms was ruled by a king the Greeks called Porus, who commanded a substantial force that included something Alexander's army had rarely faced in such numbers: war elephants. These animals were not mere curiosities, and a charging elephant could scatter cavalry, crush infantry formations, and create the kind of battlefield chaos that no amount of discipline could easily contain. The battle that followed, fought along the banks of a rain-swollen river during the monsoon season, was by most accounts the hardest-pitched engagement of Alexander's career. The crossing alone was a masterpiece of deception. Alexander divided his forces and launched a surprise attack through a nighttime storm, wrong-footing Porus and preventing him from using his elephants to contest the river itself. But once the fighting began on the far bank, the Macedonians found themselves in a grinding struggle, unlike the swift, decisive victories they had grown accustomed to. The elephants caused terrible casualties among the infantry, trampling men and horses alike, and the Indian archers fought with a tenacity that earned grudging respect from soldiers who had seen every kind of resistance the ancient world could offer. Alexander won the battle, as he always did, but the cost was significant, and the victory revealed something troubling. Porus, despite his defeat, had demonstrated that the kingdoms further east would not simply collapse at the sight of a Macedonian phalanx. Intelligence reaching the army described even larger forces gathering beyond the next river, the Ganges, including kingdoms that could field armies many times the size of what Porus had mustered. The soldiers listened to these reports with a dread that had been building for years, and for the first time, the scale of what Alexander was asking began to seem not heroic, but delusional. The monsoon rains compounded everything. For weeks, the army slogged through a landscape that seemed designed to destroy it. Relentless downpours that rotted clothing and equipment, swollen rivers that swept away baggage trains, mud that turned every march into an exhausting ordeal. Snakes and tropical diseases killed men in their tents. The campaign in India was not a swift thrust into new territory, but a slow, grinding advance through hostile terrain against enemies who showed no sign of submitting. And the psychological effect on soldiers who had been promised that the ocean lay just beyond the next ridge was devastating. Each new river crossing revealed not the sea, but another kingdom, another army, another fight. It was at the banks of a river the Greeks called the Hyphasis that the thing Alexander had never imagined finally happened. The army refused to go on. This was not a palace conspiracy or a drunken argument among officers. It was a collective act of defiance by the rank and file, the ordinary soldiers whose obedience had been the foundation of every victory. When Alexander called an assembly and urged his men forward with the kind of speech that had always worked before, appeals to glory, to destiny, to the shame of turning back, he was met not with cheers, but with silence, and then, according to the ancient sources, with weeping. One of Alexander's senior officers spoke on behalf of the men, and his words cut to the heart of the matter. The soldiers were not cowards. They had proved their courage beyond any reasonable doubt across a dozen major battles and countless smaller engagements. What they were was exhausted, physically broken, emotionally hollowed out, and profoundly homesick for a world most of them had not seen in years. The officer reportedly gestured at the ragged state of the troops and asked Alexander to look at what remained of the magnificent army that had crossed into Asia, implying that the king's obsession was consuming the very instrument that made his conquests possible. Alexander's response revealed just how deeply his sense of self had become entangled with the act of conquest. He retreated to his tent and refused to emerge for days, apparently believing, or hoping, that the army would relent out of shame or loyalty, as it had relented before. It was the same strategy of emotional withdrawal he had used after killing Clytus, the same expectation that the world would bend to his will if he simply refused to accept its verdict. But this time, the army did not bend. The soldiers waited, and they did not change their minds. For the first time in his life, Alexander encountered a wall that courage, genius, and sheer force of personality could not break through. After 3 days, he ordered the construction of altars to mark the easternmost point of the campaign and gave the command to turn back. The retreat itself became a catastrophe that rivaled any defeat in battle. Rather than returning by the relatively manageable route through the northern passes, Alexander chose to march a portion of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a vast, barren wasteland stretching across what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. The reasons for this decision have been debated ever since. Some ancient writers claimed he was motivated by a desire to outdo legendary kings of the past who had supposedly failed to cross the same desert, while others have suggested logistical considerations or strategic aims related to the fleet he had dispatched along the coast. Whatever the reasoning, the result was a disaster of staggering proportions. The march through the desert lasted roughly 2 months and killed more of Alexander's soldiers than any single battle of the entire campaign. Heat, dehydration, starvation, and sandstorms destroyed entire units, and supply lines failed almost immediately when the fleet that was supposed to provide support along the coast was delayed by contrary winds. Soldiers drank from poisoned wells and ate pack animals raw when the food ran out. Flash floods swept through dry riverbeds at night, drowning the camp followers, the women, children, and merchants who traveled with the army, by the hundreds. Ancient sources estimate that as many as 3/4 of the force that entered the desert did not emerge from it, though exact figures are impossible to verify. What makes the Gedrosian March so revealing is not simply its human cost, though that cost was enormous and largely unnecessary. It is what it exposed about Alexander's leadership at this stage of the campaign. The army had told him, clearly and collectively, that it had reached its limit, and his response was not to conserve what remained, but to drive his forces through one of the most inhospitable environments on earth. It was as though he were punishing them for the humiliation of the mutiny, or punishing himself for failing to reach the edge of the world. The line between visionary ambition and destructive obsession, always thin in Alexander's case, had finally disappeared. The man who had once inspired his soldiers to achieve the impossible was now leading them into suffering that served no strategic purpose and achieved no lasting gain. The army that staggered out of the desert and back into the Persian heartland was a shadow of what it had been, and the empire it had built was already beginning to crack. The army that emerged from the Gedrosian desert was broken in ways that no amount of rest or resupply could fully repair, and the empire waiting for it was in no better condition. While Alexander had been grinding his forces through India and then through the wasteland, the governors and satraps he had left behind to manage his conquered territories had begun to behave as though the king was never coming back. Some had raised private armies, others had looted treasuries, and a few had simply stopped pretending to answer to any authority beyond their own. The administration that was supposed to hold the empire together had, in many places, quietly dissolved. Alexander responded to this disorder with a wave of purges that bore an unsettling resemblance to the earlier killings of Parmenion and Clytus, swift, ruthless, and driven by a logic in which disloyalty once suspected was disloyalty confirmed. Governors were removed, tried, and in several cases executed. Some of the accused were Macedonians, others were Persians who had been entrusted with their old provinces, and the message was the same in every case. No distance from the king's eye guaranteed safety, and no past service provided protection. The purges restored a kind of order, but it was the brittle order of fear rather than the durable order of functioning institutions. It was during this period, after the army had returned to the old Persian heartland, that Alexander suffered a personal loss that seemed to strike him with a force out of proportion even to the bond involved. His closest companion, a man who had been at his side since boyhood, who shared his tent, his plans, and, by most ancient accounts, something deeper than ordinary friendship, fell ill and died. The grief that followed was so extreme that even sources sympathetic to Alexander describe it as unhinged. He ordered the doctor who had attended the dying man to be crucified, commanded that a sacred flame in a nearby temple be extinguished, a gesture normally reserved for the death of a king, and reportedly refused all food and comfort for days. Some accounts claim he ordered the manes of all the horses in the army to be shorn, and demanded that a funeral monument be constructed on a scale rivaling the greatest temples of the ancient world. The death of this companion removed what may have been the last human connection capable of anchoring Alexander to something outside his own increasingly unstable inner world. Whatever moderating influence the relationship had provided, and several ancient writers believed it was considerable, was now gone. In the months that followed, Alexander threw himself into a frenzy of new plans that seemed to grow more grandiose and less connected to any practical reality. He spoke of campaigns into Arabia, of circumnavigating Africa, of conquering the Western Mediterranean. These were not the focused strategic calculations of the general who had dismantled the Persian Empire with such precision a decade earlier. They were the projections of a mind that had come to define itself entirely through conquest and now faced the terrifying possibility that there was nothing left worth conquering. Then, in the ancient city that had once served as the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, Alexander fell ill. The precise nature of his illness has been debated for centuries. Ancient sources describe a fever that began after a prolonged drinking bout, not unusual in itself given that Alexander's consumption of wine had grown heavier and more frequent in his final years, but that worsened steadily over roughly 10 days instead of breaking as a simple episode of excess would. Modern scholars have proposed everything from typhoid fever, complicated by the accumulated damage of old battle wounds, to malaria contracted in the river marshes, to deliberate poisoning by members of his own court. The poisoning theory has persisted, in part because the political motive was obvious. There were powerful men who feared what Alexander's increasingly erratic behavior might cost them, and in part because one prominent ancient tradition explicitly accused a senior Macedonian family of administering a toxic substance. But the evidence is thin and contradictory, and most historians treat the claim with considerable skepticism. What is less disputed is that Alexander, still in his early 30s, had subjected his body to a catalogue of injuries and stresses that would have broken most men years earlier. He carried scars from arrow wounds, sword cuts, and at least one siege injury that had reportedly punctured his lung. He had marched through deserts, fought in monsoons, and consumed alcohol in quantities that even his contemporaries considered alarming. His body had been spent like a resource that would never need replenishing, and when the fever took hold, there may simply have been nothing left to fight it with. As Alexander's condition deteriorated, the question that had always lurked beneath the surface of his reign, who would succeed him, became suddenly and terrifyingly urgent. He had no obvious heir. His wife, from an Eastern marriage, was pregnant but had not yet delivered, and even if the child proved to be a son, an infant king would be a figurehead at best, a puppet for whichever general managed to seize control of the regency. Alexander also had a half-brother, but this man was widely regarded as mentally unfit to rule. There was no clear mechanism for transferring power, no designated successor, no institutional structure that could absorb the shock of the king's death and keep the empire functioning. Whether Alexander chose not to address this problem, or simply believed, as men of extraordinary vitality sometimes do, that his own death was an impossibility he need not plan for, the effect was the same. The most powerful empire in the known world had been built around a single irreplaceable life, and no provision had been made for the moment that life ended. Some ancient accounts describe the dying king's generals filing past his bed in the final hours, watching him struggle to breathe and asking to whom he left his kingdom. The famous answer attributed to him, to the strongest, may be apocryphal. Several historians from the ancient world report it, but others offer different versions or omit the scene entirely, and the phrase has the polished quality of something composed after the fact to explain what came next. What came next required no literary embellishment, because the reality was dramatic enough. Within hours of Alexander's death, the unity that his personality had imposed on a sprawling, fractured empire began to disintegrate. The generals who had spent years jockeying for position beneath his shadow now found themselves standing in open sunlight with no authority above them, and each one understood the same brutal arithmetic, that the empire was too large and too rich to ignore, and too weakly held together for any one of them to control. Alliances formed and dissolved within days. The army fractured along lines of personal loyalty rather than institutional obligation, exactly as one would expect from a system that had never developed institutions capable of outlasting its founder. The wars that erupted from this vacuum would drag on for more than a generation, consuming nearly every senior commander who had marched with Alexander and redrawing the map of the ancient world. These conflicts, known collectively as the Wars of the Successors, were not a footnote to Alexander's story. They were its direct and inevitable consequence, the price of having built an empire on the back of a single extraordinary individual without ever creating the structures needed to sustain it. The throne Alexander left behind was not merely empty. It was a void that pulled everything around it inward, and the world that emerged from the collapse would look nothing like the one he had tried to build. The empire shattered exactly along the lines that Alexander's own choices had made inevitable. Within a few decades of his death, the territories he had spent his entire adult life conquering had been carved into separate kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former generals or their descendants. Egypt fell to one dynasty, the old Persian heartland to another, and Macedonia itself, the homeland from which the whole enterprise had launched, to a third. These successor states would fight one another for generations, and none of them would ever reassemble what Alexander had held together by the sheer gravitational force of his presence. Yet, here lies the central paradox of everything he accomplished. The political empire disintegrated almost immediately, but the cultural transformation it set in motion proved far more durable than any border or throne. Alexander's conquests, however destructive and however poorly consolidated, had dragged the Greek language, Greek art, and Greek ways of thinking across an enormous stretch of the ancient world, from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean to the river valleys of Central Asia. This was not a gentle process of cultural exchange. It was carried on the backs of armies and imposed through the founding of cities, but the result was a new kind of civilization that blended Greek and Eastern elements in ways that neither side could have anticipated. The age that followed Alexander's death is often called the Hellenistic period, a term derived from the Greek word for Greek-like, and the name captures something important about its character. This was not a world that was purely Greek. It was a world where Greek had become the common language of trade, diplomacy, and intellectual life across a vast geographic area, functioning as a shared tongue used by people whose native languages were entirely different. A merchant in Egypt, a scholar in Mesopotamia, and an official in what is now Afghanistan might have had nothing else in common, but they could conduct business, read the same philosophical texts, and navigate the same administrative systems because Greek had become the medium through which all of these activities flowed. This linguistic diffusion had consequences that rippled outward for centuries. the great libraries and research institutions that flourished in the successor kingdoms, most famously in Alexandria, the Egyptian city that bore Alexander's name, became engines of intellectual production on a scale the Greek world had never achieved on its own. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy advanced in ways that drew on both Greek traditions and the older knowledge systems of Egypt, Babylon, and Persia. The geometry that would later be inherited by medieval Europe was refined in this Hellenistic environment, as was much of the astronomical knowledge that shaped how ancient people understood the heavens. None of this was Alexander's conscious intention. He did not conquer the Persian Empire in order to create a cosmopolitan intellectual culture, and there is very little in the ancient sources to suggest he thought in those terms. His motivations, as far as they can be reconstructed, were rooted in something far more personal, a need to surpass his father, to rival the heroes of myth, to push beyond every boundary the world placed in front of him. The cultural transformation that followed was a byproduct of his ambition, not its purpose, and this distinction matters because it points to the fundamental flaw that ran through everything he built. Alexander conquered more territory than any individual before him, but he made no serious provision for governing it beyond his own lifetime. The administrative systems he left behind were improvised, unevenly applied, and almost entirely dependent on the personal loyalty of individual commanders who had no institutional reason to remain loyal once the king was gone. He never established a clear law of succession, never built a bureaucratic apparatus capable of functioning without direct royal oversight, and never trained or designated anyone to carry on after him. The empire existed because Alexander existed, and when he stopped existing, so did it. This was not simply bad luck or an accident of dying young. It was the natural consequence of a style of leadership that could not tolerate any center of power other than itself. The same qualities that made Alexander extraordinary on the battlefield, his refusal to delegate ultimate authority, his need to be personally present at every decisive moment, his conviction that his own judgment was superior to anyone else's, were precisely the qualities that made his empire structurally unsound. A kingdom built around an irreplaceable individual is, by definition, a kingdom with an expiration date, and Alexander's refusal to acknowledge this was not a minor oversight. It was the logical endpoint of a worldview in which he himself was the point of the whole enterprise. The killing of Parmenion, the murder of Clytus, the alienation of his officer corps, the march through the Gedrosian desert, all of these episodes share a common thread. Each reveals a man who had begun to treat the people around him not as partners in a shared project, but as instruments of a personal vision that could not be questioned or restrained. The army that had once followed him out of genuine admiration eventually followed him out of fear and exhaustion, and the distinction proved fatal. Fear can compel obedience, but it cannot build institutions, and institutions were what the empire needed to survive. What Alexander left behind was not a functioning state, but a paradox. His conquests destroyed the old order of the Eastern Mediterranean and replaced it with nothing stable enough to last. Yet the cultural aftershocks of that destruction reshaped the ancient world more profoundly than any orderly succession of empires could have done. The Greek language spread further than any army could have carried it by force alone, because Alexander's campaigns had created the conditions, the trade routes, the mixed cities, the administrative demands of governing diverse populations that made a common language necessary. He built something that outlived him, not because he planned it, but because the chaos he created demanded new forms of connection that no one had foreseen. In the end, Alexander's story is not simply the tale of a brilliant general who died too soon. It is the story of a man whose greatest strength and greatest weakness were the same thing, an insatiable drive that could conquer the known world but could not pause long enough to hold it together. The empire crumbled because the man at its center had never been willing to build anything that did not require his own hand on every lever. And the culture that emerged from the wreckage endured precisely because it was no longer his to control. So consider the generals who stood beside him, who watched the drinking grow worse, the paranoia deepen, the old companions disappear one by one. If you had been among them, still trusted, still alive, still close enough to see where it was all heading, would you have spoken up knowing what it cost Clytus? Or would you have kept silent and waited to inherit what was left? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.